Hello, everyone. Welcome again for another discussion. So, during our previous discussion, we already have discussed the different changes in habitat or the different changes in climatic conditions due to the habitat alterations and how can it impose negative health hazard to human health. This lesson serves as an continuation part of our previous discussion because this will deal on the different exposure pathways. This is an alternative pathway on how we aid in transmitting diseases. So these are our learning objectives for this discussion. First is to determine different exposure pathways that leads to disease transmission. Another one is to provide example of each identified exposure pathways. So these are the things that we will be dealing, and these are the learning targets that we will be having at the end of this lesson. So before we start, let's have first an activity or a game. So what I want you to do is I want you to arrange the following set of letters to come up with words that are related to the exposure pathways. So we have here the first word, second word, third word, fourth word, fifth word, sixth, seventh, up until 10th word. So I want you to again pause this video and try to arrange these following letters or words that would relate to exposure pathways. Let's just have an icebreaker. Okay. All right. I assume that you really have answered our activity. So it's now time to check your outputs or your work. Okay, for the first word that would be all right, settlement. The second word that would be urbanization. The third one that would be inclusion. Okay. Fourth one that would be bushmeat. Next we have wildlife. We also have pathogen. For the seventh one, that would be exposure. And then for the eighth one, that would be pathway. We also have disease and habitat. So as we go on with our discussion, we will be discussing on how do these different words relates to our topic. All right, now for our second activity, I want you to look at these words, guys, and I want you to identify or classify these words if it is a vector, a causative agent, or the disease itself. So we already have discussed what are these three terms, right? The vector, causative agent, or the disease, or the vector-borne disease. So again, I want you to classify these words if it is a vector, causative agent, or the disease itself. I want you to pause this video again, and we will be checking your answers later. And there you go. So I really hope, guys, that you have answered this activity. So let us now check your work. So for the first one, we have malaria. Is it a vector, causative agent, or the disease? That would be the disease, of course. We have Aedes mosquito. These are the mosquitoes that carry different pathogens. So we have vector. We have as well simian retroviruses. So we have here causative agent. Ito yung virus na nag-cause ng vector-borne disease. Okay, Vibrio cholerae as well is a causative agent. Leptospirosis is a disease. Rodents, these are vectors. Again, vectors, guys, these are the different animals that carry the pathogen or that carries the causative agent. And then the causative agent, that is the main pathogenic organism that could really cause the disease. Okay, let's proceed. We have here dengue, and it's a disease. Giardia lamblia, that would be a causative agent. We have Anopheles, that would be a vector. And then filariasis, that is a disease. So let's try to discuss our topic further. In addition to changing the density or presence of disease-related organisms, guys, global change is also altering routes of infectious disease exposure. So as what I have told you, we will be dealing with a different route or a different pathways of these infectious diseases. So some of these new exposure pathways have little to do with the changes in the natural world, such as increase in trade and transportation, that facilitate the rapid movement of disease-related organisms around the globe. So what are the different human activities that could induce the exposure or the transmission of this disease? So, however, many of human-caused environmental change also lead to new exposure pathways. So what are now the different natural phenomenon that would lead to disease transmission? And what are also the different human-caused environmental changes that would lead to new exposure pathways? So we'll be dealing all of that one by one. So we have here a table. It deals with the mechanisms of altered infectious disease exposure resulting from environmental change. So we have here the mechanism from which the environmental change alters disease transmission. We have here changes in exposure pathways. So what are its examples? Examples to that are incursions into wildlife habitat can lead to new exposure to zoonotic disease as seen in Ebola, simian retroviruses, and probably human immunodeficiency syndrome. Again, these are the common examples of mechanisms which we can transmit diseases. So first is incursion, from which we directly consume meat and other wildlife animals for food. And then we don't know that those wildlife animals pala are infected with different viruses. So what will happen is that we also engulf those viruses and pathogenic agents since we consume the vector for food. Next is dense urban settlements with poor sanitation, waste disposal, or water treatment can lead to increased exposure to many diseases including diarrheal disease, dengue, and leptospirosis. This is very common because of the growth of population. Dili gid malikayan nga naa gyud tay poor or improper nga waste disposal. That is why our government is really doing its best to mitigate these problems. So what are the different diseases known to be impacted by this mechanism? So we have malaria, we have trypanosomiasis, Ebola, simian retroviruses, and other diseases. So as you can see here in our example. Now, let's deal with the different exposure pathways. So what are the different exposure pathways? So that we can be aware of these pathways and we can be able to do precautions about it. So first is we can induce the spread of these different diseases because we increase in global trade and transportation. So that means people living in today's society are not solitary. We are expected to move around from one place to another. So for example, the non-immune population of workers would go abroad or endemic areas, of course, to look for a job and to support their family. And then that environment might be exposed to different viruses. So, dito nyo nakuha ang katunga sakit. And then once that worker will travel, what will happen? There would be an transmission or spread of diseases. So, facilitate the rapid transport of disease-related organisms around the globe. So, kung naay ingani nga sakit sa Australia or sa China, it's not only sa China na lang. It is most likely na mas-spread siya all over the world because, again, we increase our global trade and transportation. Another one, we have direct incursions of people into wildlife habitat. So again, as what I have emphasized, when we say incursion, that is the handling, slaughtering, and consuming wild animal species. So what are the risks of this? Of course, if that particular species is exposed to different pathogenic diseases, then it is most likely that the human that will consume that wildlife animals would be also exposed to the pathogenic causative agents. So we have here, for example, the bushmeat or the bushmeat hunters who reported with direct contact with the blood or fluid of non-human primates have contracted with simian foamy virus, and of course that would lead to disease. All right. Next is we have settlement and extension of agricultural land into wildlife habitat. So in this case, guys, it is actually related with our population growth because once we increase our population, we think of a way from which we can sustain our population, 'di ba? We do research, we do agriculture to rear crops in order to suffice our needs. So because of that, there is no direct interaction between human and animals. So what are the different um, avenue from which human can have direct interaction with wildlife animals? So we have again through farming, land clearing, scientific research, even ecotourism, right? Kana mag-adto ta sa mga lugar nga dili pa kaayo modernize and maadto ta didto kay tungod gusto ta mag-relax, gusto ta mag-unwind and other conservation activities. So with that, there is now or the population, human population is directly exposed to wildlife habitat from which the wildlife habitat might be again exposed to different causative agents and again that would lead to transmission of disease. All right. So next we have urbanization. Ito, because of urbanization from an area would become more populated. And then, what will happen? Naagyud always, dili gid malikayan, it's uncontrollable for that area to have piles of waste, pools of contaminated water, and etc. So because of that behavior, sa may tabo, the people will be exposed to an unhealthy environment, and then that would lead to disease again. So yun. Next is altering the fate or transport of disease pathogens. The fate and transport of pathogens associated with waterborne disease are impacted by both climate and land use. Example, we have here the warmer temperature in Europe correlate with the increased incidence of food poisoning because the warmer temperature allow the pathogen to survive and multiply in high numbers. Now, what will happen now is due to the changes of climatic conditions, we may provide the different pathogens a healthy or a perfect fit environment for them to grow and to multiply. Another of that is kana mga exposed nato nga mga tires sa surrounding. So kita lang ang nagalet nga ay mas stagnant nga water. And because of that, mo-increase na dahil ang population sa malaria. So those activities, guys, may perhaps or may increase the population of the vector or the causative agent itself. So yun. So these are the different exposure pathways. Again, what is the goal of this topic? The goal of this is for we to be able to know the different exposure pathways and we can be able to do something about it. So again, global trade and transportation, it is the transmission of disease because of the movement of people from one place to another. Direct incursion, it is all about slaughtering and consuming wildlife animals which are infected. Like for example, the COVID-19, right? You consume ang katong bats nga infected of COVID-19. Next, urbanization that will lead to poor sanitation and improper waste management. And then altering the fate of transport disease. Again, we are altering the environment from which we can be able to provide healthy environment for them to multiply and to increase their numbers. Next, settlement and extension of agricultural land into wildlife habitat. So yun, katong direct na nato na exposure with the wildlife habitat. So any questions, clarifications, or concern? If you do have, you can message me and we'll be answering all of your concerns and questions about this topic as long as we have time. So thank you very much again, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of the day.